the way it starts. I live in the cemetery east of Hills, Minnesota, the Flower Field Cemetery. And my name is Simon Skovgaard. And I was born in, similar to Hills, Minnesota, Hills, Denmark. Spelled a little different, but it was Hills, Denmark. And I was born in 1835. So, in 1835, I was born to a family that were indentured servants. In other words, the landlord owned the tenant. Tenant farmer produced what he could, and the landlord would come in at the end of the year and take what he desired, whether there was a good crop or a bad crop. And then the family had to make do. The family also could not leave that landlord. And if they did, they were jailed or put in the front of a war to fight and never come back. The other thing, third thing, is when they died, everything they had went to the landlord. You couldn't give it to the children. So the landlord could come in and take whatever he wanted. So there was no way to get ahead. So anyway, as a young lad, I learned how to farm. And when I got the chance, there was a war going on called the Prussian War, which the Danes owned Schleswig-Holstein, and the Germans were trying to get it away from the Danes. So we fought back and forth. Eventually the Austrians came in and joined the fight with the Germans, and guess what? I was called to war. But before I was called to war, I met my wife. There was one problem. Well, there were lots of problems. One major. She was blue blood. I was commoner. Blue blood was noble. Her parents did not want their daughter matching up with a common farmer. They warned her, don't you marry him. She did anyway, and they disowned her, and she got no inheritance. But she married me, and I was the prize. So, after we got married, I had a little kid. His name was Charles. I got sent off to war. My wife, Anne Marie, stayed at home, took care of Charles, and anyway, she could hear the cannons from her front porch shooting in that war. And for about a year and a half, she had no idea if I was alive or not. The war ended, the Danes lost, the Germans took over Schleswig-Holstein, and I came marching home. But that was around 1862, and something was happening in the New World, America, and it was Abraham Lincoln that had initiated it, and it was the Homestead Act. And you were allowed to come over, didn't matter race, color, creed, or sex, you could settle on a piece of land and live there 5 years, put up some trees, and you could homestead that quarter section. So Ann and I and Charles, he was 10 years old at the time, decided to come to America. We got passage on a steamship. A sail ship took 4 weeks to get to America. Steamship took 9 days. So in 1872, we packed up our belongings, went to the port, just about ready to get on the steamship, and lo and behold, here came Ann's parents. And we thought there was going to be trouble because we didn't communicate with them. They came running with a spinning wheel. Made in Norway, and this spinning wheel was what she got from her parents as a wedding gift. So anyway, we sailed to America, got to America. Abe Lincoln had died 6-7 years before. The Civil War was over, and there was a huge movement to go west. Well, they were having trouble with some of the local Indians. In stepped Custer, who was assigned to move the Indians west ahead of the settlers. So when we got to Cedar Falls, Iowa, on the train, that's where the trains ended. So we had to come up with more transportation. So Ann and I bought a covered wagon. Somewhat similar to this one. And this was the way the West was really won, was with a covered wagon. We put all our belongings in the covered wagon. We had to select what we wanted to pull it. Horses, mules, or oxen. And each one had an advantage and disadvantage. The horse, $100, which was a lot of money. Wagon cost us about $150. The horses were fast, but they were hard on their feet. Finicky eaters, very fussy eaters. You had to bring along some oats, and they drank a lot of water. So that covered wagon, I don't know if there's one on this side or not. The barrel, the size of the barrel depended on how close you were to water, how big your family was, and what type of animals you had. The mule, stubborn, mule was strong. If you knew how to handle a mule, they were very good. Good on their feet, weren't as fussy eating, were strong, they could last longer than a horse. Problem with a mule was, if that mule was crossing the river and it started sinking in the sand, most animals thrash oxen and horses to get out of the river. An oxen would, or a mule would stand there, get scared, and start sinking into the sand. So you had to be able to coax that mule. So anyway, we chose oxen. Oxen were good on their feet, slow. You had a source of meat if they broke a leg, which they usually didn't. About 3 miles an hour was the rate that they went. They could eat sagebrush, and they didn't use very much water. So there were a lot of advantages. The other one was when you got to your destination or on the way, you could milk them. Nobody wanted to eat horse or mule. So oxen were the desired animal to pull the covered wagon. So Anne Marie and I bought a covered wagon, and there were different kinds of covered wagons. A buckboard would take 2 oxen to pull it. It was 10 feet long, 3 feet wide, and you had to put all your belongings in that wagon. A Conestoga wagon, which you probably have heard of, was longer, narrower, heavier, made more for crossing streams out east. Deep water, they floated them, and a Conestoga is different than a regular covered wagon buckboard. Prairie schooner, have you heard that name?
Yep.
As the covered wagons came across the prairie, and the big blue stem, with real tall grass, would come up just about to the top of the wagon, and all you could see were these white tops of the wagon, and they looked like sailing ships. And a sailing ship is called a schooner. So that's where the name came from. So we loaded up our covered wagon in the fall of 1872, Cedar Falls, heard stories about good land in Minnesota and Iowa. So we headed out. It was a 350-mile journey. We would make an average of 10 miles per day. So 35 days in the fall to make it over to Minnesota is where we were headed. We got as far as Ash Creek, and it was getting cold. Ann and Charles and I decided to winter over in Ash Creek. So, the stories of the covered wagon, the wife would drive. The wife had a voice that could command the oxen and make them go and stop, left and right. Something about their voice. The oxen had a yoke, but no harnesses. So the woman would drive, Simon, me, I would walk along and herd the other livestock that we were bringing along, spare oxen. We had some pigs, chickens were in crates on the wagon. And we would herd them, and little Charles, his job was to gather the fire for the evening. And you're aware of potato chips, right? Do you know what they would burn in their fireplaces? I have some here. Official Rock County buffalo chips. And the kids had to pick these up because there were no trees. Hey, come on in. There were no trees, and the grass was up to your head, and it was green. So at night we'd break these up and put them in the fireplace to cook our meals. And the job of the children was to pick up 2 of those basketfuls. And my job was to keep yelling every once in a while, don't pick up the green ones. Okay? That was one of my jokes, okay? So their job was to pick up a couple of baskets, and Anne Marie drove, and in that wagon, I've got a list here of some of the things we put in that made sense. 10 by 3, so it's about a little bit the size of that table right there. That's what had to go in, all our belongings. this is what we had to pack. Okay, 1,600 to 1,800 pounds of food. Flour. Can't even read my own writing. Crackers. Hardtack is what they call it. 120 pounds. Bacon. Salted bacon. 400 pounds. Sugar. 100 pounds. Coffee. 60 pounds. Had to have the coffee. Tea. Only 4 pounds. Beans. Rice. We had salt and pepper. Baking soda. Lard. We brought eggs along. How would you carry an egg? A fresh egg. In a wagon with no springs, no shock absorbers. We put it in with the oatmeal. You could pack eggs in oatmeal, and that would keep them from cracking. Had a shotgun, rifle, knife, plow, shovel, a scythe for cutting hay, hand rake, hoe, axe, lanterns, oil. The cow was 25 bucks, the horse was 100, the wagon 150, and oxen was 75 bucks. So we got started out, and the oxen were getting tired, and we had to throw some things out of the wagon. So there were things you found on the trail. What were those first things, do you suppose, that we had to throw out? That we didn't need? A chair. Didn't need a chair. We needed food. Second thing, a spinning wheel. Although Ann and I agreed we weren't going to throw away the spinning wheel. And you know what the third thing was later on we figured we didn't need? Any guesses? The women. What do you need the women for? That's my joke.
Yeah.
The woman was extremely important. She was the midwife, drove the oxen, and could take care of the children and cook at the same time. All those things. Excuse me. So, as we went along, took us 10 miles in a day, 35 days, got to Ash Creek, decided to winter over. And there we figured out where women learned to boss men around, because they were bossing the oxen around with their voice. That's where they learned how to boss men around. Another bad joke.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
But anyway, the next spring, early, I walked over to Hills, Minnesota. And I walked past 2 or 3 sod houses on the way from Ash Creek to over on the other side of Hills. There were no buildings in Hills, no roads, kind of a trail. Bruce was not there. Steen, which was called Virginia, was not there. And on 2 miles west of Hills, I saw this beautiful piece of ground, tall blue stem, rolly, had a little creek there next to it, and I said, this is the place. I put my stake in the ground. I went up to the courthouse in Laverne, and I registered that farm, and I paid $2 deed tax for 160 acres. And that farm was mine. The only problem is I didn't have any money. And so I had to borrow some. And that winter we planted wheat, 10 acres of wheat. The grasshoppers came and ate all but 10 bushels. and the wolves were knocking at my door. Who are the wolves?
Banker.
There you go. They wanted their money.
Yeah.
I didn't have any, no jobs. So I heard there was work in Sioux City. So I left the horse, the gun and everything with Ann and Charles, and I walked to Sioux City. 100 miles. Just under 100 miles. Got to Sioux City, no work. Then I heard there was work in Worthington on the railroad. So I walked 90 miles to Worthington, found work, saved up enough money. When I got back home, they were harvesting what little crop was left after the grasshoppers. Hired out and saved up enough money to pay my bills and to buy seed for the next year. 1873. By the way, 1873 till now is what? 150 years. That's when that stake went in the ground. I'll tell you more about that later. So, made it, got the 10 bushels of wheat off that ground, wintered over. Halfway through the winter, I came down with typhoid. And typhoid killed just about everyone. No cure, they didn't know what it was. And I struggled, and by spring I was feeling better. Got up, planted another harvest, and lo and behold, a fire came, burned within 6 feet of our sod hut, burned everything. We replanted. That fall, grasshoppers came again. Okay? We made a little more that year, had some vegetables, potatoes, and we survived the winter. The next year, planted more wheat, grasshoppers again. So we were getting a little frustrated. It looked dismal. And then all of a sudden, everything changed, turned around. I helped start a church in Martin Township, which is 6 miles by 6 miles. There were 4 Norwegian churches because you walked to church. So they had to be close by. So I helped start a church. It was called Bethany. Later they called it the Brick Church. And we had service one time a year. One service. One communion. The pastor got paid $100 for 1 year. The next year we gave him a raise. We bought him feed for his horses. But the pastor was in 4 different parishes, and then he would go out and do funerals in the homes and wedding. And that's when a lot of people would give him extra potatoes and vegetables and things like that. So this is kind of the way it went. Started a church, Bethany. As time went on, we got better crops. Trying to think. From there, Charles, my son, went to college in Augustana, which was in Canton, South Dakota. Met a Norwegian girl. You got to remember, I'm Dane. We did not like the Norwegians. And here he was getting hitched with there's a Moen down there in Inwood. Ingeborg Moen. She was the first white kid in Lyon County. And Haakon Moen, her dad, kind of went through the same things we did. And when we got to come married, notes. We both, smoked pipe, told wild stories, hardworking. We got along great. And the two got married. But they wouldn't marry us in that church. I wanted them to marry us in English. And they refused. They did in Norwegian. So I moved to another church. It was called Trinity. Trinity Church in Hills. I gave the bell for that church. My name was on that bell, Simon Skovgaard. When eventually that church moved into Bethlehem Lutheran Church, and Bethlehem was the first building in Hills, a white church, that a storm came, blew it down, killed the carpenter, and they rebuilt the church 2 years later. So eventually we merged, Trinity came down, the bell went to our missionaries in Natal, South Africa. And Bethlehem just celebrated 150 years. So over the years, my son Charles and Ingeborg had 7 children. Charles was one of the first ones to grow corn successfully, according to the Hills Crescent in Rock County. And the paper came out and declared, this is why you can't believe everything you read. It said you cannot grow corn successfully in Rock County. Charles was a horticulturalist. He grew several different kinds of apple trees, beautiful vegetable garden. And there's lots of stories about that vegetable garden. And anyway, he brought him in the fall. The Hills Crescent retracted the statement and said, I guess you can grow corn in Rock County. If you look around what they went through this year, you can raise good corn on basically dew. So anyway, Charles was the one, he was a county commissioner in Rock County. He started a creamery in Hills. They didn't want to start the creamery because they didn't have enough cows. Charles said, I'm going to double my herd. And then we'll have enough milk to make cream and get a higher price for our milk. He went from 6 cows to 12 cows. And a lot of his neighbors did the same thing, and the Hills Co-op Creamery came together. Charles also planted the trees in the Hills Park, which a lot of them are still standing today. Charles married Ingeborg Moen. They had 7 kids. The eldest was called Clara Skovgaard. And Clara married one of 3 brothers, 3 sisters from Hills, married 3 brothers from Tyler. And Clara got the pick of the litter, she claims, and married Nels Sandegger. And Nels moved down to the home farm. Clara and Nels grew up during the Depression. And the banker was going to foreclose on him because he had borrowed money for a barn, okay, for those 12 milk cows. Anyway, the banker was a good friend, and he said, Nels, you bring me meat, eggs, potatoes, vegetables, I'll write it off the note. I'm not going to foreclose on you because I've got too much land that I can't get rid of. It's hard to believe a banker having too much land and he can't get rid of it. Unheard of today. But so Nels paid it off, took him 3 years. paid it off, raised 9 children, and made it through the dirty 30s. His middle son was Sheldon Sandager. Sheldon married Elnora. Sheldon and Elnora did some mission work in Africa, and I think they're on that Hall of Fame in the museum down here, I've been told. I keep up on a lot of things, even though I'm 6 feet under the ground. We keep up on the news. So, Sheldon married Elnora. Sheldon made it through the droughts in the mid-70s, 1970s, which a lot of you might have remembered. And he made it through, what was the other thing? The 80s, when the farm crisis came, a lot of people lost their farms. Excuse me. He made it through that time. Sheldon had 5 children, one of which was Eugene. They called him Pucky. And he was a scoundrel. He was bad, you know. In every family you got that black sheep. Well, Pucky was that guy. That's me. I'm Pucky Sandager. Simon died in 1914, was buried in the Flowerfield Cemetery. But he was the one that started the whole mess, the clan, I should say. And today, the farm is, this year, celebrating, and it took me a while to figure this out, sesquicentennial, 150 years in the same family. So I'm the 5th generation. I have 3 daughters. My nephew is now the 6th. So we're pretty proud that through the years it was been able to be passed down and to be continuing to farm. But the things that made it successful, one was a belief in God. Belief in a good family. Hard work and honesty and perseverance. A lot of times, anybody in that heritage could have thrown the towel in and said goodbye. I was tempted many times, but made it through, and now we're trying to get it to the next generation. So that ancestor, Simon, 1872, who put that stake in that ground and said, I don't want to be a slave. I don't want anyone to control me, tell me what I can do. And he did whatever he could to protect that. And the next generation did it, and the next one, and the next one. So the family is extremely important. I tell jokes about my wife, and she's probably the reason I'm still here and help our family struggle through our different issues that we had when we grew up. And that is the story of Simon Skovgaard, his life and his sacrifice, and how it survived time. So we'll see what happens. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming. If you have any questions, I gave you just a short story of some of the things. There's one I left out. Anyone know what this is? yoke, and you put it around, and you would hook your pails, carry your water, milk, whatever you had to, with that yoke. And if I put this on, I can't get my neck through that hole. This is the original one. Wendell over here put it on, and it fit him just perfect. And the problem is I don't have any water for him to carry. But I have restored a couple covered wagons. One is in the museum down here, and it has, when you see it, your mind goes back to what they did and how they persevered coming across on that prairie. Simon's closest neighbor, I think they said, was 2 miles away. Nothing there. So, okay, with that, I'm going to close it up. Any questions about the story or something that didn't make sense? When I do the other presentation, it's about Haakon Moen, who is from Inwood, whose daughter Ingeborg, the first little white girl in Lyon County, how she grew up and married Simon's son Charles.